You to our talk this afternoon on editing the papers of Clarence Mitchell Jr. with my esteemed colleague, Professor Denton Watson. The event today is co-sponsored by the School of Arts and Sciences and Old Westbury's newly established Black Studies Center, and I'm particularly grateful to the program logistics team, Dr. Jermaine Archer, Dr. Danielle Lee, Ms. Michelle Malone, and Ms. Anne-Marie Jimenez. Thank you all so much for putting everything together. So just briefly, as you see up front, the Mitchell Papers is an ambitious 9-volume project that upon completion will span the years from 1942 to 1978. And there are currently 5 volumes published with a 6th one on the way. Editorial work, as I know many of you know, is grueling. Editors need to be detail-oriented and patient. They're detectives who spend months on a single footnote. Believe me, I know. Mandy knows. Denton knows. And a strain of perfectionism doesn't hurt either. So to tell you more about our own resident editor and his work on the Mitchell Papers project, please welcome Dr. Jermaine Archer, Associate Professor of American Studies and our mediator today. Sorry, moderator. Moderator, mediator.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, do I need this? Can you hear me? Is it on? I need it for the audio. Okay, okay, got it, Oz. Okay, so really excited to be here for Professor Watson. This amazing work, it's being recorded, which is exciting, and we're gonna make sure that that recording lives as the inaugural event for the launching of the Black Studies Center, Old Westbury, really exciting time. And so I had my introduction with me. I think I lost it, but we'll try to make something happen here. And I'm excited that it's sort of an intimate room here with some really smart people that have worked in areas that can really, I think, center the significance of your work, which the opportunity to do so, I think, is now. So my first beginnings at the college 19 years ago sort of has come full circle today. I started working as an assistant archivist, or maybe that wasn't the formal title, but I was an assistant archivist for the Martin Luther King Jr. papers in Atlanta. So I went to Clark, Atlanta. I was under the direction of Cynthia Lewis, well-known archivist, and then worked with noted scholar Claiborne Carson on the King papers, right? And was in Coretta's house, and then sort of hauling boxes and doing fun sort of assistant archival work. And I had applied, and I'll sort of make this part quick. I had applied. I was in graduate school in California and knew I wanted to come back to Long Island, and saw a post from Dean Jim Lana, who was advertising for a Harlem Renaissance course. He interviewed me. I didn't get the job, but they kept my resume, and then got a call maybe a year or two, a couple years later, from Rosalind Baxendall, but to teach a course. They had, I guess, kept my resume on file. But in between that time, I had saw a post for an assistant at the Clarence Mitchell Papers Project, and being from Long Island, knew I was coming home. I applied, and I got the job, right? And so, but, attending to some family things, my father, also a graduate of SUNY Old Westbury, had a business at the time, and I was working with him, so I didn't stay there for too long. And it was after that time that I worked with Denton that maybe a year after I came back to the American Studies Department, and then saw Denton and said, hey, right, and sort of, I'm back, right? But, this is sort of my beginning. And I think it's important to mark the significance of what's happening in 2023, the political climate, the social climate, but certainly with the advanced placement course in African American Studies. And then, one of the things I think about, I had asked Michelle, and oh, thank you. Michelle is amazing. Right on cue, I'd ask Michelle, right? Michelle. So This was, I don't know if you all can see it. I don't want to move it for the camera. This was the last event on campus that we did on Denton Watson. February 18, 2014, 1 o'clock. This was the last event. This is the second event since then. So you can do the math. This was the first event ever. I'm speaking loud for the camera, even though the room is not. The room is thin. This was the first event ever on campus on Denton Watson and the Clarence Mitchell Papers Project. The first event. I was chair of the department. I had just started chairing. Having worked with the project, I said, well, has it been centered? What have we done? He said, nothing. So that was mind-boggling in and of itself. And for me, I think it's important that we give visibility to our own voices, which are magnificent, and the work we do is always bigger than us, I think, right? There's no way that it makes sense, and I know I'm talking to the choir, right? But when we think about the magnitude of Clarence Mitchell and the magnitude of having a collection of papers at SUNY Old Westbury, then when we walk around with the inferiority complex like, oh, we don't do this and we need to do that, and they don't know how great we are and all of that, when what's happening meticulously just behind the corner, nobody sees, no visibility. I worked at the Clarence Mitchell Papers Project after working on the Martin Luther King Papers Project. Everybody should be here. But don't get mad. Don't come in the room feeling embarrassed, right? Don't come in the room feeling like, what happened, right? Don't do that. Just know that Black Studies is coming, right? And just close the loop, whatever the loop is. But it's glaring, it's absolutely glaring that this is the second event for the Lion of Congress. It's always in the bylaws. It's always in the governance. It's always in the structure. So if we're talking about faculty governance, if we're talking about anything within the bylaws, how can we miss the Clarence Mitchell Jr. Papers Project? Period. It's the lesson of governance. It's the lesson of structure. Right here. Not forget because it's paramount, but how important the project is, how esteemed it is that we have it here at Old Westbury. He's looking for a home. He's been looking for a home. For this? For this? You know how many schools would want this? How many schools money would come in for this? Sorry, folks. I don't care what the discipline is. I don't care what the politics are. I don't care. Really don't. There's no way we as SUNY, who's talking about social justice, right? Who's talking about intercultural understanding? If this is the second event, I did the first. So when the dean asked me, would I do this? I said, of course. I'd be excited to. We don't know our gifts. We don't know what we have. Because if we did, everybody would be talking about this project. Everybody would be coming to him. If we really knew what Clarence Mitchell Jr., if we knew the civil rights movement, and we know it's 4 volumes here, should be getting Newsday, New York Times. That's okay, the Black Studies Center, we'll net. So our call to action is for all of us to recognize the privilege and honor of this work. The Black Studies Center would be honored to support and to house such an esteemed collection. Danielle Lee and I have a forthcoming podcast. We'd be interested to have you on the Southback podcast. This Black Studies Center very mission aligned with the mission of Sojourner Truth. And as part of broad public history, the Old Westbury Oral History Project, Mandy Friskin's Songs Without Words, this is part in a much more, we need to showcase it, right? And I have your intro here, but I've said a lot. It's time for you. Professor Denton Watson.
Thanks so much, Jermaine, for that generous and warm introduction. I appreciate it very much. Thank you also, Dr. Cheryl Wilson, Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, and for the other members who are here from American Studies Department and from elsewhere. Thank you so much for being here. With your demonstrated support here today, I feel confident that I will find the strength to continue with my mission to complete the remaining 3 volumes of the 9-volume Papers of Clarence Mitchell Jr. Papers Project, and thus be able to move on to the green pastures of retirement. That's a little ways ahead, of course. Sometime in the fall of last year, Darrell Meadows of the National Historical Publications and Records Commission in Washington, the agency that funds the Mitchell Papers Project, to the tune of $125,000 a year, informed me in the presence of Dr. Duncan Corliss and Dr. Barbara Hillary that his agency was committed to continue its support for another 10 years to the Clarence Mitchell Jr. project. That is great. In total, that will be another $1 million plus in support of the NHPRC. In support, the NHPRC will be providing for the Clarence Mitchell Jr. project. So, with that type of support, I'll make a valiant effort to complete my life's mission. You know, at the memorials program for Dr. Butts there, just recently, last month, Dr. Sams, our president, noted that we can't live forever, so leave a legacy. This is my legacy. And so I've been working now to complete, I'm working now to complete volume 7 by the end of the year. At a rate of completing a volume in 3 years, I should complete the project within the NHPRC time frame. I pray I'll have the strength for that. My task today is to celebrate the publication of volume 6 and volumes 5 and 6 of the Papers of Clarence Mitchell Jr. Volume 5 is centered on the monthly and annual reports of Clarence Mitchell Jr., which documents the passage by Congress of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Volume 6 is a companion volume and documents Mitchell's struggle for the passage of the 1960 Civil Rights Act. Getting Congress to pass the 1957 Civil Rights Act was a landmark achievement for Clarence Mitchell because that law marked the first time in 82 years, that is, since Reconstruction, that Congress was made to pass the civil rights law. Despite his initial disappointment with the weakness of the 1957 Civil Rights Act, Mitchell quickly realized that getting Congress to pass the law was a monumental achievement because it broke the psychological barrier in Congress to the passage of civil rights laws. For, indeed, the NAACP had been seeking to get Congress to pass, most notably, a law to provide prominent punishment for the horrific crime of lynching, since soon after its founding in 1909. The 1960 Civil Rights Act was intended to strengthen the 1957 Civil Rights Act, but it failed to do so. In effect, both volumes 5 and 6 document the struggle that Clarence Mitchell Jr. led to get Congress to take this historically defining step to address the nation's most wrenching social issue, which is racial discrimination in all forms. Celebrating Mitchell's life in an obituary article in 1984, Joseph Stern, my late boss, who was editor of the editorial pages of the Baltimore Sun, noted that, compared to other civil rights figures, there are so few monuments to Mitchell for his legendary civil rights contributions. Joe Stern wrote, with one major exception, that is the Clarence Mitchell Jr. Courthouse in downtown Baltimore, one would search in vain for similar memorials to the chief black architect of the laws that have revolutionized race relations in the United States. And as socially defining as the race issue has been since 1619, when the first Africans were brought to America and sold into bondage at Jamestown, Virginia, the extremely challenging struggle to pass those two laws have not been as fully appreciated as they should be for their seismic historical importance in shaping how Congress was made to join the judicial and executive branches in contributing to the steps taken by our government to fulfill the promise of equality for African Americans. And what was Clarence Mitchell Jr.'s role in winning this faltering participation by the Congress in the struggle to make the promise of equality a reality for all citizens of this great nation? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that men are created equal, is the defining mantra of American democracy. What a mockery that promise was for black people. Well, just think about this. At the peak of his career as a civil rights lobbyist in Washington in the 1960s, Clarence Mitchell Jr. was popularly called the 101st Senator. In 1968, at a farewell reception for President Johnson, organized by a group of black federal workers in Washington, LBJ recognized Mitchell accordingly. He didn't have the highest title in the room, but all in all, LBJ said, he, Clarence Mitchell, forced down my door more than any other person. When Clarence Mitchell died in 1984, Senator Howard Baker eulogized him on the Senate floor accordingly. In those days, Clarence Mitchell was called the 101st Senator, but those of us who served here then knew full well that this magnificent line in the lobby was a great deal more influential than most of us with seats in the chamber. Senator Ted Kennedy remembered him for becoming the conscience of the Congress on civil rights. Every civil rights bill that has been enacted into law over the past generation is a milestone of progress and a monument to Clarence Mitchell's vision, leadership, and commitment, Kennedy said. Senator Kennedy added, it would take several volumes to record his life and achievements. Well, that is what I have been doing since 1979, when I formally began my mission to ensure that the contributions of Clarence Mitchell will never, ever be written out of American history. Why? Because as long as the Republic stands, Clarence Mitchell Jr.'s works and contributions to strengthen the foundations of American democracy will be essential for the study of how the goals of the modern civil rights movement was fulfilled. Here is another tribute to his contributions. Senator Mathis of Maryland noted that for more than 30 years, Clarence Mitchell was a force to be reckoned with on Capitol Hill. Since his first testimony in 1934 before a congressional committee to testify in favor of anti-lynching legislation, in all, Clarence Mitchell testified on Capitol Hill 178 times. Now listen to this. By contrast, how many times did the Reverend Martin Luther King testify? Once. Okay? So, Senator Mathis of Maryland noted that in his myriad appearances before Congress, that is, Clarence Mitchell has addressed legislation affecting virtually every aspect of American life: voting rights, judicial and executive branch nominations, health, social security, foreign affairs, minimum wage, revenue sharing, full employment, youth employment and labor, federal court jurisdiction selection, education, housing, full employment, youth employment, labor, federal court jurisdiction, judicial selection and confirmation procedures, and urban decay. I am proud to say that in our work at the Clarence Mitchell Jr. Papers Project, we have collected every one of Clarence Mitchell's congressional testimonies and are providing progressive lists of those testimonies in the volumes we are publishing. Here is another tribute. President Biden, as Vice President, when asked to name some of his political heroes, responded. Wolf Tone, I don't know who he was, but Wolf Tone, Robert Kennedy, Clarence Mitchell, longtime NAACP leader, chief lobbyist, Mike Mansfield, and for his integrity, and Hubert Humphrey for his heart. Again, those were Biden's words. Biden got to know Mitchell well when he was a senator from Delaware. Born, raised, and schooled, for the most part, in Baltimore, as I document in Line in the Lobby, my biography of Clarence Mitchell Jr., he took the major step to become a civil rights lobbyist when he joined the staff of the Fair Employment Practice Committee in 1942. He then assumed supervisory positions by overseeing the work of the agency's field operations that were the defining features in the fulfillment of the agency's mission. Mitchell and all of the other professionals working with him represented the first group of blacks who were hired as line officers in the service of their country. The role of the FEPC in civil rights history cannot be overstated. The agency was created in 1941 to implement President Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 that barred discrimination in the war industries that was based on race, creed, color, national origin, or alienage. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 to stave off a protest that threatened, to stave off a threatened march on Washington by A. Philip Randolph to protest discrimination in the war in the defense industry. Randolph was a dynamic black leader, so you can well imagine how his threat resonated throughout white Washington, a mass of black people coming to tear up the nation's capital. That was the same type of terror that greeted the announcement of plans to stage the March on Washington in 1963. Let's see if this isn't working. And the leader here is Roy Wilkins of that. Okay, again, it was Roy Wilkins. So it was A. Philip Randolph who proposed the march in 1963, and the NAACP under Roy Wilkins, whose picture you see here, was the NAACP who made the March on Washington in 1963 happen. As I note in Line in the Lobby, the issuing by President Roosevelt of Executive Order 8802 on June 25, 1941, was the most celebrated act in the battle against the racial discrimination in the war industries. That date marked the launching of the modern civil rights movement. That statement by me when I began Mr. Mitchell's papers, Clarence Mitchell Papers project in 2000 was greeted at the time with much consternation and disbelief by many civil rights historians. But the documentation in the first two volumes of the Mitchell Papers of how the black executives in the FEPC systematically worked to define racial discrimination so that they could be effective in attacking the problem, I think I can safely say that no one would now attempt to question or discredit my assertion that the modern civil rights movement began in 1941. As for the historical importance of the FEPC, here is what Roy Wilkins executive secretary, again his pictures here, of the NAACP said, "Never in the history of the United States has a president issued an executive order which is at once a condemnation of racial discrimination as a policy and a powerful aid economically to the well-being of Negro citizens." Lerone Bennett, the historian and executive editor of Johnson Publications, which published the now defunct Ebony and Jet magazine, said, "Up until then, that is, the creation of the FEPC, the dominant issues in Negro life were poll taxes legislation, anti-lynching legislation, separate but equal school facilities, and the white primary. But from 1941 on," Bennett said, quote, "Negro's tragedy would be based implicitly and explicitly on the necessity of decisive action by the federal government. It would be based too on the need for unrelenting pressure on the government." And who devised that strategy of placing unrelenting pressure on the federal government? That leader, of course, was none other than debonair Walter White, executive secretary of the NAACP from 1931 to 1955. A report prepared by an NAACP staff member that I have in my files documents the many times that Walter White requested meetings with President Roosevelt to address problems affecting blacks. That hammering on the president's door was a strategy that A. Philip Randolph so effectively employed to get President Roosevelt to legitimize his threat of the March on Washington in 1941. And of course, you now know where I'm going, which is to say that that was a strategy Clarence Mitchell Jr. exercised so effectively as director of the NAACP Washington Bureau in his determined efforts to get the nation to live up to the promise of equality for all Americans. At the end of World War II, Mitchell had the sad task of closing down the FEPC after Southerners in Congress killed it by cutting off its funding. Mitchell then joined the NAACP staff as Labor Secretary, and subsequently he was promoted to director of the NAACP Washington Bureau. Here on Capitol Hill, he became the NAACP's chief strategist. He developed legislation for implementing the association's egalitarian philosophy. And as Senator Ted Kennedy said, he sought the passage of civil rights laws in Congress to uphold the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. The laws he sought were all designed to assure the equality promised by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and to protect the 15th Amendment rights of blacks at the ballot box. But Mitchell's struggle in the 50s were no easy task because the country was operating under the racist separate but equal doctrine. And until 1957, the Southerners in Congress made sure no civil rights laws were ever passed by reminding Mitchell that in practicing segregation, they were not discriminating. So there was no need for Congress to pass civil rights laws, they insisted. Consequently, for example, when Mitchell came to Washington, he and other blacks like Robert Weaver, a top black housing official in the city, could not eat in the cafeteria in the Congress building or use the main elevator there. They had to go around to the back to use the service elevator. In those times, blacks were not addressed with courtesy titles of Mr. or Mrs. So when Clarence Mitchell testified at Senate hearings, that Senator James O. Eastland of Mississippi was chairing. When it came time for Eastland to call on Mitchell to testify, to avoid addressing him as Mr., Chairman Eastland would simply look around in the room and said, "Anyone next want to testify?" So that was the experience there for blacks of Mitchell's stature there in Washington there. Clarence Mitchell, though, had a thick skin to that kind of racist insult. After all, he was born and raised in border state Maryland, which, as residents there would say, was neither north nor south. So rather than discouraging him, those practices only reinforced his determination to seek passage of civil rights laws to make America a better place to live for African Americans. Clarence Mitchell simply went about his business of making the NAACP Washington Bureau act as the eyes and ears of the NAACP in the executive branch of government and the executive halls of Congress. In those years of his work, having seen the benefits of presidential leadership that Franklin Roosevelt displayed when he not only established the FEPC, but he affirmed the principles that there should be no discrimination in federally funded programs, Clarence Mitchell made the struggle to get Congress to approve legislation to make the FEPC permanent his holy grail. In 1964, he eventually succeeded in this mission when Congress passed the Omnibus Civil Rights Law with its Title VII provision that enabled the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The EEOC is a latter-day version of the FEPC. So there was the Equal Employment Opportunity principle to Mitchell that he carried that effort with him up to near his retirement when he gained passage of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, which strengthened the Title VII provision in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. At the same time, Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination in federally funded programs. This title codifies the Powell Amendment principle that Clarence Mitchell also carried over with him from the FEPC when, as I have noted, President Roosevelt mandated that there should be no discrimination in defense programs because they were funded by the federal government. But at this time of history, after the FEPC was killed in 1946, Clarence Mitchell established the first decisive step when on July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman granted his wish by issuing his own executive order prohibiting discrimination in federal employment, and afterwards another covering private employment. After that, Mitchell got President Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson to keep those programs alive by issuing their own executive orders to again keep the FEP principle alive. Let me jump ahead here a bit, please, and pick up. As I note in line in the lobby, the obvious turning point in Mitchell's struggle to get Congress to pass civil rights laws came in 1954 when the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954 that said segregation was discrimination, and thus it was unconstitutional. That ended the separate but equal doctrine. As we all know, even though the Brown decision directly resulted from the NAACP's fight to end school segregation, the decision represented a social revolution that inherently changed the social character of the nation. As seismic an impact as Brown represented, though, in the annals of civil rights history, the beginning turning point as far as the struggle to pass civil rights laws was concerned was the report that President Truman's Committee on Civil Rights issued in 1947. President Truman created the committee in 1946 in response to the thunderous demands by NAACP's Walter White and blacks in general that he take action to end the explosion of lynching and other forms of violence that were occurring that year. The committee, entitled To Secure These Rights, was a remarkable document that gave political strength to the struggle for civil rights for all citizens, regardless of race, color, religion, or social status. Civil rights, the committee report said, after all, are statements of aspirations, of demands which we make upon ourselves and our society. As I note in line in the lobby, in short, 1947 was the year in which the national government, led by the president, went on record as being officially opposed to racial segregation and stopped just short of declaring that blacks were entitled to equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment. Yet, the implication was strong. Through its comprehensive list of recommendations, the report provided, to secure these rights, provided a blueprint of legislation that was needed to protect the citizenship rights of African Americans. By 1955, Mitchell had developed a strong working relationship now with Herbert Brownell, President Eisenhower's Attorney General. Brownell explained to me in an interview the extent of his support for the NAACP civil rights programs. Eisenhower repeatedly expressed his support for efforts to end segregation in the armed services. Eisenhower's experiences in World War II convinced him that discrimination was harmful to the fighting effectiveness of the American military. But President Eisenhower was not a full-fledged supporter of civil rights. Even so, Eisenhower also recognized that in post-World War II America, segregation and discrimination were extremely damaging to the country's efforts to woo the support of Africans and other non-white third world nations when their diplomats visited Washington and suffered the pain of Jim Crow practices that were so common to African Americans there. This racism was especially harmful in the Cold War period when America was competing with the Soviet Union to build world supremacy. The leadership of the administration's civil rights initiatives did not come from the president, but Attorney General Brownell, who was entrusted in building the Republican Party in the wake of the solid foundation that Franklin Roosevelt had established. So, and I'm coming to an end now soon. Under Brownell's leadership, the Eisenhower administration embraced the NAACP school desegregation program and submitted an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in support of the Brown versus Board of Education case. And to move ahead, I'll show the picture of Isaac Woodard there, an Army veteran whose eyes were gouged out by police, law enforcement officials there in a southern town. Woodard, well, let me read. Woodard, a decorated World War II black Army veteran, was traveling home in uniform on a bus from Georgia to North Carolina when he protested the treatment he was receiving from the bus driver. For that protest, the local law enforcement men beat and blinded him with their sticks. It gouged out his eyes. The attack on Woodward was typical of the violence black servicemen in uniform were receiving in the South from law enforcement officials. The other notorious example of violence that Mitchell used in his effort to get Brownell to support legislation to protect blacks from lynching were the example of Emmett Till, who was killed, brutally murdered in Mississippi. In the bill that was then, the 1957 Civil Rights Bill, that became the Civil Rights, in the bill that became the 1957 Civil Rights Act, Mitchell proposed a title, or included a Title III provision that Brownell himself had devised in an attempt to get Congress to pass a law to end such types of discrimination, in other words, by providing punishment for such crimes. But that bill was taken out. And so the 1957 Civil Rights Act, in sum, did not have that cardinal, that key provision there. But it did provide, it did elevate the civil rights section of the Justice Department there to a civil rights division with an assistant attorney general there in charge of that division. And it also created a Civil Rights Commission, United States Civil Rights Commission, that became a landmark or a very important federal means for researching and highlighting various aspects of discrimination throughout the South that were essential for the preparation of legislation there that became part of the Civil Rights Bill. So at this point, I will end that because I've been going on for a while, and I appreciate your presence here very much, and I thank you so much for coming and so forth. Thank you.
That was great. As we're thinking about all the momentum in the woodlands, I think we're going to have the lion in the woodlands.
Lobby.
The lobby, right? The
Lobby.
lion in the lobby
Lobby.
of the woodlands. This one? This one?
No.
So hold both? Yeah. I'm going to drop both mics after this. Okay. So we're going to open it up for questions, and I just wanted to say a few things that I was sort of thinking about. You know, so we could joke about this now that we're on the other side, Professor. I think, right? When I was working for the Mitchell Project, and I first started there, you know, I just finished graduate school and was thinking about, you know, what would I do? Wasn't really sure even right after graduate school. But I said, well, here's a nice sort of place. And when I went, a good professor had me just read for like a week, right? He would say, right, just sort of, sorry. He would say, just read, right? And I'd come back and just read, right? And, you know, having you know, worked with Claiborne Carson and Cynthia Lewis on the Mitchell, on the King papers, I thought I was disillusioned by just having to read. But when you think about all, and I've since absolutely, and I knew back then, but didn't understand the degree to which I do now, the magnitude of the lion in the lobby, and how much he was doing. I mean, the intersections through probably any theme or episode in the 20th century has to engage with Mitchell, right? I mean, even you go before, but I mean, Wells's anti-lynching crusade, right? I mean, voting and you know, education and the judicial, the executive, and how many, if we teach Birth of a Nation, right? Mitchell, if we teach Birth of a Nation and we're talking about Birth of a Nation, here's our counterpoint, right? How do we miss, you know, the first Hollywood blockbuster, Woodrow Wilson shows it in the White House, but yet this is up against it. This is the counter. You know, so, and then the civil rights movement, I think so much of your work is like my work on slave narratives. It's about sort of recovery work, right? You know, the work on Tubman, the work on Douglass, the work on A. Philip Randolph, who, you know, you're thinking about that we think about the 60s, but it's really that double victory campaign, the black press, right? You know, victory abroad, but victory at home against Jim Crow. And we don't know enough about A. Philip. We don't talk enough about A. Philip Randolph. But this is interesting to think about why, when we think about the civil rights movement, why Mitchell, right? Why we don't talk about him enough, right? The why is interesting, right? Thinking, and then, you know, this work here that's being done, you know, sort of in invisible ways absolutely matters now. Voting, oh, right? Education, judicial, executive, right? The infrastructure, local chapters. If we're talking about faculty governance, Mitchell, right? Has to be an example. Students have to lean into it, right? So I think I'm not upset that the room's not packed. I'm not. I see it as opportunity, right? I see it as opportunity for us to really, those who are in the room, and everybody who's in the room can out of the folk who are in the room, we don't need nobody else. Promise you, these folk right here. I'm talking to the folk in the room who magnify this because it's that big. I work on the Harriet Jacobs. Jean Yellen has her papers at Pace University. the Harry Jacobs Papers Project. When I go places and they say, oh, how did Pace get it? Right? So, you know, I just thinking about that. And then I think that was it. That's all I wanted to say. Good job. We're excited about it. Good job. We'll open it up for questions then.
Keep it quick. So the
Okay.
I can use my teacher voice. Okay.
One?
If you're late, it's two different things.
The other one? Yes. Okay.
So it's a short question. I don't need my question for you is, how did you get to Clarence Mitchell? I mean, you've spoken about this as kind of a career-making project, and you've certainly convinced us as to the why Clarence Mitchell, but I'm very curious about the how Clarence Mitchell.
Thank you so much for asking that question. You know, I joined the NAACP staff in 1971. Roy Wilkins, it was Roy Wilkins who hired me there. I was a journalist before, and then he hired me to join their public relations department to be trained to take over that office. In that position, I met Clarence Mitchell Jr., and I'll never forget, I went down to his office there in Washington. I took a shuttle down, and I went to his office. He wasn't there then, but I sat and waited for him in his office, and it covered. Then you had those little pink notes there for messages, and his desk was covered with all those messages. Clarence came in, and he sat down, and a big brother talked to me, and he told me about his project, and he got me to do a brochure on his struggle for the passage of his 1957 Civil Rights Act. That was my start. And then now, when I was ready to go to the airport now to catch a shuttle back to New York, he said, how are you getting to the airport? I said, I'll take a taxi. He said, no, you don't have to do that. I'll take you there. And he did. And that impressed me so much that I kept bugging him to allow me to do a biography of him until finally when he retired, he agreed to have me do that. And then I left the NAACP staff, went down to Baltimore to join the editorial board of the Baltimore Sun newspaper, which gave me access to him because Baltimore was Mitchell's hometown. And there I met him and his wife, and we countless sessions there of countless interviews there with them, and I learned so much about them. They were my tutors, initial real tutors, but two of my main tutors in the NAACP, because I also learned so much from the national office there, first, and from those who had led the struggle there, which brought about the success of the modern civil rights revolution. So that's how I got to know him. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Am I loud enough?
Does she need this one? No. Okay.
I think you're absolutely right that no one would disagree now that the modern civil rights movement began in the early 1940s, 100%. But it's interesting that there aren't a lot of major figures who were active both in the 1940s and in the 1960s. So to me, Mitchell is really remarkable for the longevity of his career and his influence. And it makes me a little curious about how he navigated the difficult interim of the Red Scare and the red baiting that many civil rights activists and organizations faced in the 1950s. So I would wonder, would you talk a little bit about how he navigated the red baiting that the civil rights movement faced in the 1950s?
The NAACP was led in fighting the communists there then, who were relentless in their efforts to infiltrate the NAACP branches throughout the country. And that was a major part of the work. And as a result of that, Herbert Hoover gained a lot of respect for the NAACP staff and what it did in terms of keeping the communists out. Mitchell, of course, in Washington, he worked above that, in that his work was strictly with the Congress and the congressmen there and trying to get them to do the right thing by passing civil rights laws and so forth. So that's how he rode above that tide there, but he was still very much involved in terms of keeping them out of that of the NAACP.
Thank you.
Yes.
In her introduction, Dean Wilson mentioned the joys of the detective work that go into this kind of project. And you've lived inside Clarence Mitchell's head for a long time. Are there documents that you find, or a document that you really got excited about when you first found it?
So many, true. And right now, I'm going through an interview or an oral history he did for the Kennedy Library. And there's so many revealing for me, even at this stage. And I just did that a couple of weeks ago there, and continue to do that there. I still haven't finished reading it yet, but there's so many, really, documents. It's rich history. Thank you.
I don't have a sense of who Clarence Mitchell is, and I wonder if you could describe, if he's an amazing lobbyist, what is his special genius as a lobbyist, as a legislative person? And then also, who's he allying with? You contrast him with Martin Luther King, and I'm just wondering, who are his key allies in his lobbying efforts?
First of all, Clarence worked with conservatives as well as liberals, for the simple reason that he believed in the humanness of people. That if you can reach the human side of even your strongest enemies, except for James Eastland, of course, and those other lawmakers of that ilk, then it's not that it's not possible to reach them, or it was not possible for him to reach them. But there are other conservatives. He reached out many conservatives there on both sides of the aisle that he worked with. And so that was how he was able to do it. And, the amazing thing was that he was a lone black man there in Washington and working on Capitol Hill for the longest time. And yet he was able to find openness there among all of them, except, again, the Southerners. And so the other part of the question was, huh?
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was curious about the particular skills he had.
The skills, well, that was it. Being able to reach out to people. Being able to reach out to people. And that's how he did it. And he appealed to them what was wrong. And so he just pursued and persevered and got them to join his struggle, or to support, won their support. Yeah.
Thank you so much for, I learned a lot today. If we started a Clarence Mitchell class today, what would be the main objective that you wanted students to understand about him? What would you want students to walk away from when learning about his life?
About Chancellor's life?
His life, his activism, his everything.
His belief in the Constitution, his belief in the foundation of democracy. That was what he believed in. He also believed that he did not believe in turning the cheek. That was not his thing, because he often talked about the students. He said he just couldn't see how they could allow someone to beat them and spit on them and all of that and not react. So he was not of that ilk, but he would be very persevering in terms of his mission in life.
So if I were to teach a class about, if you would, with your permission, at some point, right, on Clarence Mitchell, for me, it would be framed around the lion and the rabbit. The lion.
Love it.
Lion. If I were to teach the class, the lion
In
and
the
the
law.
rabbit. So I'm switching this. My class is your work. It's your work. It's my class. It's your work, it's
Okay,
my
okay.
class. It's your
As
work,
long
it's
as
my
I
class.
understand, that's what you're doing.
Your work is my class, right? So I would teach it, and this is, I'm thinking about Lana's question, thinking about Carol's sort of broad, sort of how do we center, how do we place Mitchell? And one of the things I'm thinking about, so he's this lion who is really maneuvering this relations genius. Anything we're thinking about public relations, right? And not only Watson, but what Watson learned from Mitchell. But the lion who when we think about fables and folklore, he's absolutely the lion of the lobby. But he's also like Brother Rabbit, Brer Rabbit in African American folklore, right? Yeah, man, he's from Jamaica, like Anansi the spider. My father's from Jamaica, by way of Costa Rica, right? And so, Anansi the spider, right? Brer Rabbit, Brother Rabbit, these African American folk tales where the lion and the rabbit, it's the lion and the rabbit, so he's the lion. But if you know anything about Brother Rabbit and these African American folk tales, E.L. Adams, the great folklorist, Sterling Brown, the great folklorist, has a wonderful, I think, metaphor that pairs the lion with the rabbit. In slave folklore, the rabbit might have appeared to be weak, might have appeared to be, right, might have appeared to be unknowing, right, but he was cunning, right, to his success or to her success. So it's hard to sense where do we place Mitchell. He had to survive, right? You couldn't place Mitchell. You couldn't detect, right? And so for him to be at that table, right, that art, the adeptness, the skill of being able to be, I won't call him rabbit now until I teach the course, but the lion, it's the lion and the rabbit, right? And Doc knows what I mean. So.
One of the best examples of how Clarence Mitchell functioned, worked, and I had it in the original draft of my presentation here, but I had to cut it, was how he worked with LBJ and how he got to know LBJ. When Lyndon came into the Senate there, he represented the Hills country there down in Texas, and he was a racist, open flame. But Mitchell started reaching out to them, and they'd have big battles there out over various provisions in the law and all of that. And then Clarence recalled for me how one day, one afternoon when the Senate was out of session, LBJ invited him into the majority leader's office there. And the both of them sat down, and the LBJ poured both of them a drink. Now, Mitchell was a teetotaler, but he still had the glass there in his hand, swirling it and tinkling the ice and so forth. So then LBJ said to him, now just look at us here, Clarence. Both of us here, you're black, I'm white, and we're here having a drink. This shows you the amount of progress we have come through in this year, how we can make progress. And Clarence turned to him and said, or looked him straight in the eye and said, if my mother-in-law, his mother-in-law was Lily Carroll Jackson, who was one of the pioneers, matriarchs, the civil rights matriarchs in Baltimore, in Maryland, throughout the state, running the NAACP as such. But she was extremely conservative in her way of life, especially back then. And Clarence said to him, if my mother-in-law could see us here now, drinking like this here, then of course, she's a teetotaler, LBJ, Lyndon, we would be in much more trouble than if the Ku Klux Klan saw us drinking here together.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that concludes what really has been a great experience. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Thank you, everybody who put this together. Our chair. This has been amazing. Spread the word, Mitchell. These Mitchell. Thank you.
Thank you so much.